morning, Social Work 300 class. My name is Tashina Miner, and I'm a political science major, and I'm here today to present you my data that I found and interpreted on the Louisiana Slave Database. The data that I used was retrieved from the Louisiana Slave Database. This database holds over 100,000 records of individual slaves who were brought to Louisiana during the 18th and 19th century. There are a total of 114 areas of information. The information that's included in this database consists of slaves' age, race, sex, marital status, their occupation or skills, anything that you can think of. This database pretty much holds that information about particular slaves that came to Louisiana during that time. I selected to use the age, race, sex, language. Each graph that I provide for you is based on percentages that represent that each slave. I'll give you a little bit of background information on this project. During 1984, Dr. Gwendolyn Hall, who was a professor at Rutgers University, she stumbled upon an immense amount of data in the courthouse. 15 years after that, she finally published and released the data to the public. The data consisted of the background information of over 100,000 slaves that I previously mentioned that were brought to Louisiana during the 18th and 19th century. To better calculate and process the information retrieved from the recordings of the documents, she created the Louisiana Slave Database. Okay. To go up here to the methods and measurement, Dr. Hall created the Louisiana Slave Database to share information about slaves with historians and basically to the public. Anyone who's interested in anything about slaves, she provided this free access to all of us, to do research as I have done on it. In order to use this information, I downloaded the database and the code book. I primarily use the code book to basically help me understand what the variables represented. For example, in the code book, you would have an entry for AFLANG, which is AFLANG, and in the code book, it would define what does that variable mean, and that variable typically means the African languages of the slaves. I created my own code book to be able to form my own 5 detailed graphs as is shown below. I then went on to use the student version of SPSS to open and analyze the data. I created the charts, like I just mentioned, by selecting the age, sex, occupation, race, and language variables. I then proceeded to the chart builder where I selected to use a pie chart and several other bar charts to represent this information. Findings and discussion. Graph A is about the African language. We have several different languages on here. We have languages from the Gur, the Mande, the West Atlantic, just different places around, the world that the slaves were taken from. We have their languages and what slaves, were associated with those languages. Okay, we have that graph A shows that majority of the slaves that were documented spoke the language of Benue Congo, which was at 37% of those slaves actually spoke that. The second language that was that slaves typically spoke would be the language of Mande. That will come in second. Graph B was actually about the sex that was documented of the slaves. So we have a pie chart that represents the amount of males and females that were founded back then in the slave community. We have 42% of those were males and 38% of those were females. We have another 20% that's undocumented. That'll represent the 20% of slaves that that they didn't really document their sex on that. Graph C depicts the age categories that the slaves fell in during that time. That can be anything from unborn, nursing, infant, child, young, adult, old. 10% of the slaves that were taken from Africa, when they arrived in Louisiana, they were recorded under the adult category. Typically, there was more adults than that, but we have a large percentage of slaves that were undocumented. So it typically maybe was more adults that came from Africa during that time, but as of right now, it only shows 10% in the actual slave database. To go on to my next graph, which is the skills, and it's basically represent all the skills or the occupations that slaves can hold at this particular time. The highest occupation that we see slaves in during that time would be in the domestic work, and the lowest would be in the healthcare field. Typically, slaves didn't work in the healthcare field, or they didn't, have any skills in that field. My last graph that I did would be the race of the slaves. There is a lot of different race. A lot of people don't know, but there's a lot of different race of slaves that were actually brought to Louisiana during that time. Of course, blacks were the highest at 80%. You know, it was 80% black slaves that were there, but there was actually white slaves and mulatto slaves and Indian and Greek slaves also. To conclude all of this presentation, I basically would like to say after reviewing and analyzing the data from the Louisiana Slave Database, I am more familiarized with the individual information of the slaves. You know, it provided me with so much information. I could just, access the data and I could see, this particular slave fell into the adult category. She had 3 kids, and so on. It provided me with a lot of detailed information that hasn't been out there until now. Dr. Hall, she created a user-friendly and modern form of reviewing slave documentation. Like I said before, I use the database that Dr. Hall created to explain the slaves' African language, sex, age, race, and things of that sort. The reference that I use with, as I said, the Louisiana Slave Database, which I just downloaded the data from there and processed it through SPS. Well, that'll conclude my presentation. Thank you. You have a nice day.